The Mirror in Room 13. Late autumn evenings at the Crestwood Hotel were always quiet. The off-season left the sprawling Victorian building almost empty, save for a few travelers passing through the small town. Tonight was one of those nights, silent, except for the occasional howl of the wind and the distant creaking of old wood settling. Catherine sat behind the front desk, flipping through a magazine to pass the time. She had been the night manager here for 3 years, and nothing much ever happened. But that was exactly how she liked it. Calm, predictable. Until tonight. At 11:45 p.m., the bell above the front door jingled, startling her from her reading. She looked up to see a man step inside, his dark coat dripping with rainwater. He had a pale, tired face and dark circles under his eyes, as though he hadn't slept in days. He approached the desk slowly, his gaze distant, as though he were thinking of something far away. "Good evening," Catherine said, her voice a little softer than usual, sensing something off about the man. "How can I help you?" The man glanced around nervously, then leaned in closer. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I need a room," he said, his tone urgent but hollow, as if the request itself was a burden. "Just for tonight?" "Of course," Catherine replied, tapping on the keyboard to check availability. "We're pretty empty right now. You'll have your choice of rooms." The man's eyes darted to the old-fashioned key rack behind her, scanning the numbers. His hand twitched slightly, and when he spoke again, his voice trembled. "I want Room 13. Catherine paused. "Room 13? That one's usually not—" "I'll pay double," he interrupted, his voice strained, almost desperate now. "Please, I need that room." Catherine hesitated. Room 13 wasn't supposed to be available. It had been closed off for years after a string of strange occurrences, and the owners had decided it was best to keep it out of use. But the man's urgency and his offer made her reconsider. The hotel had bills to pay, after all. "All right," she finally said, reaching for the tarnished key labeled 13. "But I should warn you, it's an old room, not as well kept as the others." "I don't care," the man said, grabbing the key with trembling fingers. "Thank you." He turned and walked down the long hallway without another word, his shoes squeaking against the worn carpet. Catherine watched him disappear into the shadows, a strange unease settling over her. Room 13. Why would anyone ask for that room? She tried to shake the feeling and return to her magazine, but she couldn't focus. Her mind kept wandering back to the stories she'd heard about that room. Strange noises, sudden cold drafts, reflections in the mirror that weren't supposed to be there. At 12:30 a.m., a loud crash echoed from down the hallway, making Catherine jump. Her heart raced as she stood, the sound reverberating in her ears. She grabbed a flashlight and hesitated for a moment before stepping out from behind the desk. The hallway was darker than usual. The old wall sconces flickered, casting eerie, wavering shadows along the corridor. Catherine's footsteps echoed in the silence as she approached room 13. Her hand trembled slightly as she raised it to knock, but just as her knuckles grazed the wood, the door creaked open. Inside, the room was dark, save for a single lamp in the far corner, casting a weak yellow glow. The air felt heavy, thick with something unnameable. The man sat on the edge of the bed, his back to the door, staring into the tall, antique mirror that stood against the opposite wall. His coat was still on, his shoulders hunched, as though weighed down by an invisible burden. "Is everything all right, sir?" Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond. His gaze remained fixed on the mirror. "Sir?" she repeated, stepping cautiously into the room. Her eyes flicked to the mirror and her stomach churned with unease. There was something wrong with the reflection. It showed the man sitting on the bed just as he was, but there was a shadow standing behind him. Tall, dark, and faceless. Catherine blinked, thinking it was a trick of the dim light. But no, it was still there. The shadow loomed over the man, its outline flickering like a figure on an old, static-filled television. "Sir," she said again, her voice cracking with fear. "There's something behind you." Finally, the man moved. Slowly, he turned his head toward her, his face pale and drained of all color. His eyes were wide, terrified. His lips parted slightly, and when he spoke, his voice was hoarse and barely audible. "I know." Catherine took a step back, her pulse pounding in her ears. The man's eyes flicked back to the mirror, his face contorted in fear and despair. He stared at his own reflection, and the shadow seemed to grow darker, closer. "It follows me," he whispered. "Everywhere I go. It follows me." "What is it?" Catherine asked, her throat tight with terror. The man shook his head, his eyes never leaving the mirror. "I don't know. It started 6 months ago. I thought it was just nightmares at first, but then I started seeing it in the mirror, always behind me, always watching. I've tried everything to escape it. Nothing works. And now—" He swallowed hard, his hands trembling in his lap. "It's getting closer." Catherine's skin prickled with fear. She glanced again at the mirror, her breath catching in her throat. The shadow was moving. Slowly, but unmistakably, it was creeping toward the man, its faceless form somehow conveying a deep, malevolent intent. "You need to leave," Catherine said, her voice shaky. "We need to get you out of here." "I've tried," the man whispered, tears welling in his eyes. "But it follows. No matter where I go, no matter what I do, it's always there." Catherine took another step back, her eyes darting between the man and the mirror. The shadow was closer now, nearly upon him. She could feel its presence, cold and suffocating, like a heavy fog filling the room. And then the man spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. "It's too late." Before she could react, the shadow lunged forward in the mirror. The glass rippled like water, and the dark figure reached out, its form distorting as it wrapped around the man's reflection. He screamed, a terrible, soul-piercing sound, as the shadow dragged him back into the mirror's depths. Catherine stood frozen in horror as the man's reflection was swallowed by darkness. The mirror rattled violently, then went still. The room fell into an oppressive silence. The man on the bed was gone. Only his coat lay crumpled on the floor, as if he had simply vanished. Catherine backed out of the room, her breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. She slammed the door shut and ran back down the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. Behind her, she swore she heard a faint, distorted voice echoing from room 13. It was his voice. "I can't escape." Back at the front desk, Catherine fumbled with her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed the police. But when she glanced up at the lobby's large, ornate mirror across from the desk, her blood ran cold. In the reflection, behind her, a tall, faceless shadow stood watching,